Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into regional analysis, and I want to start with a question for you.
Think about it for a second. At first glance, they couldn't be more different, right? You've got your dinner plans, a kind of vague cultural idea, and then this massive physical landscape. So, what on earth is the connection?
Well, believe it or not, that's the answer. Every single one of them is a perfect example of a region. It's one of the most fundamental concepts geographers use to make sense of our world.
And here's the key takeaway, right here. Regions aren't just there. They're not naturally occurring facts. No, they're human constructs. You should think of them as tools, like a set of lenses that geographers use to organize the world and spot patterns we might otherwise totally miss.
And that brings us to the core idea we're going to unpack today, this idea of the world's invisible borders and how we actually go about defining them.
So how do they do it? How do geographers draw these lines? Well, they look for common threads. A region might be defined by something physical, like the specific climate and landforms of the Amazon basin. Or it could be cultural, like the shared languages that help define what we call Latin America. It could even be economic. Think of the shared industrial history of the U.S. Rust Belt. Or, of course, it could be political, like the member countries of the European Union.
Okay, so all these different characteristics lead us to a really neat framework. Basically 3 distinct ways that geographers approach drawing these lines on a map. I want you to think of this as the essential geographer's toolkit. We're going to break down the 3 main types of regions. First, you've got formal, which is also called uniform. Then there's functional, or nodal. And finally, perceptual, which you'll sometimes hear called vernacular.
All right, let's dive right in. We'll start with the 2 that are probably a little easier to get your head around, the most concrete and measurable types.
So first up is the formal region. This is any area that's linked by one or more shared, measurable traits. The big idea here is uniformity. That trait is consistent across the whole area, and because of that, the boundaries are often pretty clear-cut.
For instance, any country is a perfect formal political region. The Sahara Desert, defined by its super-arid climate, is a classic formal physical region. And any area on a map where Buddhism is the main faith, well, that forms a formal cultural region. In all these cases, the lines are relatively sharp. Okay, next up we have the functional region. Now this one's different. Instead of a shared trait, this area is all organized around a central point, or a node. It's defined by a shared activity. A great way to picture it is like the ripples from a stone tossed in a pond. The influence is strongest right at the center, and it just fades the further out you go.
And this, right here, is where our pizza delivery zone finally makes sense. The pizza shop is the node, and its delivery area is the functional region. Simple as that. The same logic works for something huge, like the Chicago metropolitan area, which functions around its downtown business district, or even your local school district, organized around its central office. So let's just quickly put these 2 side by side to make sure we've got it. A formal region is all about a uniform shared trait, like a climate zone, and it usually has a clear boundary. A functional region, on the other hand, is built around a central hub, like a newspaper's circulation area, and its boundary is way fuzzier. It just fades out with distance. Okay, so we've covered the regions you can measure and the ones that are organized around a hub. But now we're getting into the really fascinating stuff, the regions that exist only in our minds. This is what we call a perceptual region. It's not defined by any official data or clear boundaries. Instead, it's shaped by our shared feelings, our collective beliefs, and our cultural identity about a place. The boundaries are completely vague, based on what you might call folk geography, not objective facts. And this really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? Perceptual regions are all about identity. They reflect how we see ourselves and how we see others.
And I bet you know exactly what I'm talking about. Places like the South in the US, or the Middle East, or our original example, the American Midwest. If you ask 10 different people to draw a line around the Midwest on a map, I guarantee you will get 10 different maps. And that feeling, right there, that's the hallmark of a perceptual region.
So, we have our 3 tools. We've got formal, functional, and perceptual. But what happens in the real world when the lines drawn by these different ways of seeing the world actually clash? This is where things get really complex and really important. Because here's the reality check. The world is messy. Regional boundaries are almost never clean, sharp lines. They're more like transitional zones. They overlap. And very, very often, they are deeply contested. Let's take Iraq as a case study. It's a powerful example. If you look at it through one lens,
It's a single functional region. It's one country organized around the political and economic node of its capital, Baghdad. But if you look through another lens, you see three very distinct formal regions defined by the major ethnic and religious groups: the Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurd.
And this is why this whole thing matters so much. It's not just some academic exercise. When you have this kind of fundamental mismatch, where the functional political boundaries don't line up with the formal cultural ones, it can be a source of enormous and sometimes incredibly violent social and political tension.
And if you want a tragic but powerful example of how this can play out, just look at the history of Sudan. Before 2011, it was one single country, one functional region. But inside that border were two very different formal regions, a mostly Muslim north and a mostly Christian south. That deep mismatch fueled decades of brutal conflict, and ultimately it led to the country literally splitting in half in 2011, creating South Sudan. That was an attempt to redraw the functional map to finally match the formal cultural one.
So you see, it all comes back to this one number, 3. 3 simple tools. Just understanding the difference between formal, functional, and perceptual regions, it gives you a surprisingly powerful framework to analyze and understand some of the most complex events happening around the globe.
And that leaves us with a final thought to take away. Now that you have this toolkit, start looking for the invisible borders that define your world, in your city, in your neighborhood, maybe even in your own sense of identity. And then ask yourself the most important question of all: who gets to draw the lines?